Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're traveling back in time to the Greek Archaic Age, a period stretching roughly from 750 to 500 BC. Now, this era is absolutely fascinating because it's defined by a massive, frankly, uncomfortable contradiction. On one hand, this is the exact moment in human history when the radical concept of political equality is born. It's a total game changer. But on the exact same timeline, it's the era that systematized absolute human bondage. To really understand ancient Greece, we have to hold both of these realities in our minds at the exact same time. To grasp just how fundamentally the archaic Greeks reinvented human community, let's look at this quote from the philosopher Aristotle. He believed that humans were by their very nature meant to live in a polis. To him, the idea of living entirely outside this new system was literally unimaginable for a normal person. You'd have to be a wild beast or an immortal god. For them, this specific type of community became the absolute defining feature of what it meant to be a civilized human being. But what exactly was a polis? Well, we usually translate it as city-state, and it's the very root of our modern word politics. But it wasn't just a physical place with stone walls and buildings. It was an active, breathing partnership. It united the urban center with the rural farmers and the surrounding countryside into a single, cohesive community, all organized around a completely novel principle: citizenship. Okay, let's dive into this and map out our journey today. We're going to cover 5 key areas. First, the birth of the polis. Second, Greek expansion and trade. Third, armies and political equality. Fourth, the rise of chattel slavery. And finally, women in the Archaic Age. We're going from the revolutionary birth of equality straight into the dark shadows of systemic oppression. Section 1. Birth of the polis, a radical new community. So why did this happen here? Following the total collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, small, localized communities started forming in the power vacuum left behind. And when they finally did organize, things moved incredibly fast. Just look at this timeline. Around 750 BC, we see city-states forming socially. Over the next 2 centuries, they're founding colonies everywhere. The idea spread like wildfire. By 700 to 650 BC, heavily armored hoplite infantry becomes common. And by 600 BC, the grim institution of chattel slavery is heavily entrenched. In the grand scheme of human history, this is an explosive, rapid progression of society over just a century and a half. So the crucial point we need to take away here is this radical invention: legal equality. In the ancient Near East, society was incredibly stratified by wealth, but in this new Greek system, the expectation of equal treatment under the law was extended even to the absolute poorest freeborn local men. Now, sure, a poor citizen might still lead a physically deprived life, but he possessed a distinct personal freedom and a baseline of legal protection that officially separated him from foreigners and slaves. Section 2. Greek expansion and trade, beyond the homeland. Greece is, as you probably know, famously mountainous, and booming populations quickly led to a major scarcity of arable farmland. To survive and find new trade markets, these city-states had to look beyond their own borders. But they didn't just wander off aimlessly. Colonization was a highly structured, organized procedure. First, the mother city, or metropolis, makes a formal decision to expand, often after consulting the famous oracle of Apollo at Delphi. Second, they choose a kistes, basically a founder. Third, when they arrive at the new site, land is carefully parceled out. And finally, even though this new colony becomes its own independent city-state, it's expected to maintain deep, loyal ties back to its mother city. And this brilliantly illustrates that colonization wasn't just some fun, adventurous choice. For places like Thera, it was a brutal, forced necessity for survival. Take their colony of Cyrene in North Africa. Thera was starving, so ordered by Apollo, they drafted 1 adult son from every single family. If a young man refused to get on the boat, the death penalty. No exceptions. If a father tried to hide his son, his entire property was confiscated. Talk about intense pressure, right? Section 3. Armies and political equality. Power to the poor. This brings us to a major historical mystery. Why on earth did rich, land-owning elites ever agree to share power with men who literally had nothing? Historians debate this heavily. You've got the traditional hoplite revolution theory. This suggests that men who acquired enough wealth to buy their own heavy bronze armor formed a unified phalanx and essentially threatened a military strike to force elites to share power. But actually, scratch that, there's a huge hole there. It doesn't explain why the absolute poorest men who couldn't afford any armor also got the vote. That leads us to the poor militia theory, which argues that masses of lightly armed poor men throwing rocks and wielding farming tools were actually the essential tide turners in Dark Age warfare. They earned their political rights in exchange for their vital military support. Because, let's be real, the elites definitely were not handing over power out of some romantic nobility. As the poet Alcaeus bluntly put it, money is the man. No poor man ever counts as good or honorable. The social elite completely despised the poor. For the poorest citizens to actually gain access to the political assemblies, they had to hold genuine, undeniable leverage, likely through their sheer numbers and their absolute necessity in defending the city-state. Section 4. The Rise of Chattel Slavery, the Dark Shadow of Freedom. Let's move to the next part and see how this builds into the grim paradox of the Archaic Age. It's the exact moment freedom was defined, absolute enslavement boomed. You see, defining an exclusive club of citizens inherently required defining who was excluded from that club. Freedom from the control of others became a necessary precondition for citizenship. So, paradoxically, the sharpening idea of what it meant to be a free individual created the complementary rise of the unfree. By 600 BC, creating this exclusive club required a massive underclass, stripped of all humanity, treated legally simply as living property. And this wasn't just a small-scale operation. It was a vast, systematized foundation of the Greek economy. Household slaves handled cooking, weaving, and fetching water. Public slaves were literally owned by the city-state itself, working as coin certifiers or even official executioners. Temple slaves served the gods. But the absolute worst fate? The silver mines. Men were leased out to work in agonizing, dark, landslide-prone tunnels, breaking their backs. It's truly horrific to think about the sheer scale of unfree labor that was completely propping up this so-called free society.
Section 5. Women in the Archaic Age, Citizens Without Votes.
Now let's transition to our final section by examining the complex status of another group. Women were legally considered members of the community. They were citizens, but their status was heavily subjugated under the concept of the kurios. Greek society was intensely paternalistic. Every single woman was legally required to have an official male guardian, a kurios, usually a father, uncle, or husband. While this meant women were legally protected from horrors like kidnapping, it also meant they possessed absolutely zero political power. This created a really fascinating dual life for Greek women. Think about the contradiction here. On the public side, they were entirely excluded from assemblies and relied on men for all legal disputes. But on the practical side, the self-reliance of the entire household economy, the oikonomia, depended completely on their labor. They managed the finances and the slaves. Without women running the show at home, men literally wouldn't have had the free time to go participate in politics. Plus, women held immense public prestige by officiating vital religious cults that kept the city in the gods' good graces. Now, what's really interesting about this traditional betrothal vow is how bluntly it frames marriage. Spoken by the male guardian to the groom, it goes, "I give you this woman for the plowing of legitimate children." Yeah, no romance there, right? Marriage was explicitly viewed as a transaction designed solely for reproduction, producing heirs and preserving the family's property. These intense paternalistic rules were literally baked right into their mythology. The poet Hesiod writes about the Pandora myth, framing women as a beautiful evil sent to punish mankind. Yet, he warns that if a man avoids marriage to escape women, he'll reach old age with no one to care for him, and his precious property will just be divided up among distant relatives. So, women were basically viewed as a necessary burden just to ensure generational wealth was passed down. So what does this all mean? How do we reconcile the birth of profound political equality with the systemic oppression that funded it? The Archaic Age gave us the brilliant blueprint for citizenship, voting, and civic participation. But we can't ignore that it was a blueprint built firmly on the backs of unfree labor and the strict subjugation of half its citizens. As we look back at the origins of our own political ideals, it's an incredibly uncomfortable paradox that we absolutely must hold in our minds. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this leaves you eager to question the true cost of ancient progress. Catch you next time.